Adolf Hitler's National Socialists swept to power. The Nazis vowed to restore Germany's pride and prosperity. With all opposition parties crushed, the Nazis' first priority was to restore the nation's confidence and sense of worth. Hitler sent the German people back to work. Unemployment was cut by over 50% in under a year. By 1939, most of Germany was working again. But it was all part of Hitler's greater plan for the Third Reich. The famous autobahns would one day speed the flow of his armed forces across Germany. For the German people, life was good again. Their sense of shame following defeat in World War I had been replaced by a new sense of unity and optimism. The Nazi Party began to infiltrate all aspects of day-to-day life. The German people found themselves increasingly marching to the tune of fascism. Under the careful orchestration of his propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, Hitler became the focus of fanatical adoration. In the eyes of the German people, he had become a messiah-like figure, the leader who was sent to save them and make Germany great once more. As the German people fell under Hitler's spell, the nation's Jews, communists, socialists, all enemies of the Third Reich, were excised from German life. Hitler's utopian vision was of a 1,000-year Reich, a master race, an idealized folk community of the strong, the pure, and the beautiful. As early as 1924, Hitler had recognized the importance of capturing the hearts and minds of Germany's young. The Hitler Youth Movement was the perfect tool for mass indoctrination. By 1936, membership was compulsory. At vast rallies, thousands gathered to pledge their fervent and devoted allegiance to the Führer.
Mein Lebenskampf ist nicht umsonst gekämpft. Denn so wir zeigen, soll er vor sich hertragen und wir werden in unserem Zeichen wieder siegen!
In Mein Kampf, Hitler had written that the young would be systematically tempered and hardened for the demands to be made on them in later years. Boys were issued with uniforms, their youthful aggression harnessed. Hitler's youth would become Germany's army. At his country retreat in the hills above Berchtesgaden, Hitler and his favored ministers discussed the fate of Germany and the world. As the empire expanded, Hitler turned his sights to the rest of Europe. On September the 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland.
Deutschland! In uns marschiert Deutschland und hinter uns kommt Deutschland! Wohl ist zum Ausdruck bringen, dass ich anständig meine Zeit verwendet habe im Dienste meines Volkes. Die tue jetzt eines Hitler mit Ja, eure Schule wird die ganze Nation gehen, dass ich anständig meine Zeit verwendet habe.
Communist Russia and the capitalist West joined forces to defeat Hitler's expansionist aspirations. The Second World War raged for 6 years. By 1944, the end was nigh for Germany. On April the 20th, 1945, the Russian army entered Berlin. 10 days later, Hitler committed suicide. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years and 3 months. Hitler's dream of a master race had come to a catastrophic end. Amongst the ruins of the Reich, the German people scrabbled for survival. 20 million were homeless. Give me 5 years and you will not recognize Germany again, Hitler had promised his people before the war. But he betrayed their trust. Their hopes were destroyed by his own ambition. Hitler had offered Germany a utopia built on megalomania and racial hatred. His vision had created a hell on earth. In China, it was a communist revolutionary who promised his people a new, egalitarian utopia. From his stronghold in Yan'an, Mao Zedong evolved his master plan for the world's greatest communist utopia. While he took example from the teachings of Marx and Lenin, Mao's revolutionary dream was aimed at the peasants. They would be the reapers of his continual revolution. For more than 2,000 years, China had been ruled by imperialist emperors. At the beginning of the 20th century, 90% of the population was still confined to the poverty of the countryside. Following the overthrow of the Manchu dynasty in 1911, China descended into political turmoil and continuing hardship. Before Mao's dream of a communist utopia could be realized, he had to defeat the forces of a powerful rival party, Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang. A long civil war ensued. Mao achieved victory in 1948. Chiang Kai-shek and thousands of refugees fled to Taiwan. On the 1st of October 1949, Mao Zedong became the first leader of the People's Republic of China. His 27-year democratic dictatorship had begun. Mao's priority was to haul China into the 20th century. Frustrated by the slow pace of change, in 1958 he embarked on the Great Leap Forward. It became the age of the backyard blast furnace. 600,000 miniature furnaces were set up across China in an attempt to double its steel production. Villagers gave up their tools and cooking pots to be melted down. The spirit of communist ideology thrived. Mao glorified the peasants of the new people's communes. In return, they followed his every whim. Nothing was to stand in the way of the Great Leap Forward, not even the birds of the air. Every time a bird took a grain of rice, it deprived the people of food. Or so the theory went. Mao mobilized the whole of China to kill the sparrows. The Great Leap Forward was turning into a grotesque failure. Fewer sparrows meant more insects. The overproduction of steel took millions of workers from the fields. Crops failed. Famine ensued. 20 million people died for the sake of Mao's grand experiment. But Mao was the great survivor. Communist ideology became Mao Zedong thought. The whole country was steeped in the teaching of the Little Red Book. In 1966, the Cultural Revolution saw the climax of Mao's personality cult. Endless atrocities were committed in the name of ideological purity. Anarchy ensued as the factions Mao had unleashed struggled for his inheritance. By 1978, they had corrupted his already distorted utopian dream. In the ancient kingdom of Cambodia, a man planned to replicate Mao's 27 years of continual revolution overnight, and he plunged his country into a 20th century dark age. In April 1975, the communist Khmer Rouge army entered the capital Phnom Penh. At gunpoint, they marched the 3 million inhabitants out of the city. Pol Pot, leader of the Khmer Rouge, demanded total social revolution. Cambodian history was to begin again at the year 0. The entire Cambodian population was forced into the countryside. In Pol Pot's warped vision of rural utopia, money was banned, religion outlawed. Life easily expendable. Buddhist monks were declared parasites. Of the 2,500 monks at the start of Pol Pot's murderous regime, only 70 survived. The renamed Democratic Republic of Kampuchea became a nation of workers and peasants. They toiled in the fields for 16 hours a day. Those who fell by the wayside were simply executed. Hundreds of thousands died from exhaustion, hunger, and disease. Only when the Vietnamese entered Cambodia in 1979 was the full horror of the killing fields revealed. Thousands had been systematically murdered by the Khmer Rouge. Their crimes: they spoke French, they had an education, they wore glasses. More than 1.5 million Cambodians lost their lives in Pol Pot's quest for utopia. 20% of the population had died. The 20th century has been witness to some of the worst acts of genocide in history, all in the name of ideological utopia. Throughout their long history of persecution, the Jewish people always held on to their utopian dream. A return to Zion and the creation of an independent state of Israel. Thousands of immigrants poured into Palestine to lay the foundations of their ancestral homeland. By the start of the Second World War, over 250,000 Jews had arrived in the Promised Land. The horrors of the Nazi Holocaust brought thousands more. International support for Jewish statehood grew. In America, President Truman increased his political involvement in response to growing public pressure. Truman backed the partition of Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states. In 1947, the United Nations adopted the partition plan. On the 14th of May, 1948, David Ben-Gurion became the first president of the State of Israel. No longer refugees looking for a homeland, the Falashas are in search of recognition of their Jewishness. Israel today seems less like the utopian dream it set out to be. It has become a country embroiled in conflict. The Jews may have secured their ancestral homeland, but in doing so have evicted another people from theirs. The realization of utopia has come at a high price. Religion is the oldest utopia of all. Iran would bear witness to the greatest religious revolution of the 20th century. In the 1920s, the exploitation of the oil reserves beneath the desert sands of Persia transformed the country's economy and way of life. The revenue from the oil fueled the country's rapid industrialization. Persia was renamed Iran and remodeled along Western lines. In 1941, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi became Shah of Iran. In what became known as the White Revolution, he turned Iran into one of the most westernized nations in the Muslim world. Western methods of education were adopted. Women were given greater freedom and the right to vote. Boys and girls sat alongside each other in school. The Shah welcomed businessmen from the West and encouraged foreign investment and imports into the country. But Iran's wealth remained unfairly distributed. As the rich became richer, a growing number of religious leaders spoke out against what they saw as corrupt, immoral Western influences. The leader of the movement against the Shah was the exiled Ayatollah Khomeini. On the 8th of September 1978, 750,000 of his supporters marched towards the center of Tehran. As they approached Jalal Square, the Shah's troops opened fire.
Let's go, come on.
100 people died on a day that was to become known as Black Friday. But the Shah's brutal suppression of the demonstrators did little to dampen their calls for religious revolution. Martial law was imposed, but still the protests continued. By December, the number of protesters calling for the death of the Shah and the return of Ayatollah Khomeini had swollen to 5 million. This time, the troops didn't open fire. The Shah's reign was over. In January 1979, he left Iran, never to return. A month later, Ayatollah Khomeini returned from exile. For the millions of Iranians who welcomed him home, life was about to change dramatically. The Ayatollah imposed Islamic law. Women were obliged to adopt the veil. Bars and cinemas were closed down. Alcohol and Western music banned. The Ayatollah's return to Iran signaled the start of a worldwide Islamic revolution. In Iran, America and the capitalist West became the new enemy of the Ayatollah's Islamic utopia. Half a century, Walt Disney has recreated a lost world of fantasy and adventure. In Disneyland, any dream can come true. But now, Disney have taken a slice of the American dream and turned it into reality. A few miles south of the Magic Kingdom, the cardboard facades of Disneyland's Main Street are made of real bricks and mortar.